Thanks everyone for listening. This is State Representative Kate Lipper-Garabedian. I'm glad to have you joining us for another Conversations with Kate podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking with Steve Smith, who wears many hats, including as my constituent in Malden. Steve is also the Chief Information Officer at the Cambridge Public Schools, and he founded the Student Data Privacy Consortium. So we're here today because we've been working over the course of now a couple years almost together on the issue of student and educator data privacy. We both have background in that professionally and care about it personally as well. And I've been so thrilled to be able to rely on Steve for the bill that I filed, H127, the Student and Educator Data Privacy Act. Many of you in the community may have heard me speak about this issue. This is my priority bill for the session. You all know that I'm a former 7th grade public school teacher. When I was teaching in the Atlanta Public Schools several decades ago now, all my student records were created on paper, and I filed them away in a real cabinet, and there was not much online at all at that time. Now, as the mother of a 3rd grader or someone who's worked in the education space as an attorney, I'm very aware that all of our students' data is digital. And yet Massachusetts is one of only 5 states in the entire country that have not updated our state laws to reflect the digitalization of student data and to set a basic framework of expectations for how that data needs to be kept secure, private, and confidential. And so relying on experts like Steve, who is living in this space every day, has been so critical to me drafting that bill and filing it in the legislature. I'm so thrilled that it got a favorable review from the Education Committee, and just this week was referred out to the House Ways and Means Committee, where we'll continue to advocate and hopefully get it to the finish line this legislative session. So Steve, thank you so much for being with me today and for all of your help over the course of my relatively short career as a state representative.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Kate. It's my pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed working together on this bill in particular.
That's great. So maybe you could share with people who are listening a little bit about your background professionally and what led you to the Cambridge Public Schools and then also to found the Student Data Privacy Consortium.
Sure. So I've been in this space for 26 years. I started, I moved to K-12 from a state agency in Maine 26 years ago and became the director of technology in the relatively small school district where my children were going to school. And I remained there for almost the entire time that they went through school, so 11 years.
Wow.
And then I moved to Cambridge 15 years ago as kind of a career change and just a change, lifestyle change. We were ready to move to a more urban area. So when I arrived in Cambridge 15 years ago, Cambridge already had this awareness around their students' data, their children's data. Where was it going? Which was way ahead of the rest of the country. This was before In Bloom, which was an issue that brought student data privacy to the forefront. So it became an issue that I focused on when I came to Cambridge and started to address internally in Cambridge how we vet applications, where the data is going, and talking to vendors, and realized that it takes a lot of work for any single district to address these issues. And over the next few years, as the technology exploded, it became more and more of an issue. In Bloom happened in 2013, so awareness across the country started growing. And I realized, the majority of districts across the country don't have the resources that Cambridge do.
Sure.
And how could we make this easier for districts instead of everyone doing the same thing we did as far as building internal practices and procedures and model data privacy agreements? So we expanded across the state of Massachusetts and created the Massachusetts Student Privacy Alliance and just invited other districts to join us and build awareness around this. And we shared our procedures and our tools for managing data privacy agreements. And then eventually, about 7 years ago, it created the Student Data Privacy Consortium. The idea being, could we replicate what we were doing in Massachusetts across the country? Again, because the majority of school districts just don't have the resources and the capacity, and it's a universal issue, right? To address
Absolutely.
Privacy at the classroom, and we were looking for ways to streamline that for all school districts and vendors to work together to solve those issues. So today, fast forward. The consortium is now in 31 states across the country. In 4 countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all participating. Really just getting together, and it's made up of districts, state agencies, and vendors coming together to try to solve these issues around student data privacy, because we all want to protect the data of our students.
Right. You know, in many policy areas, it makes sense to start locally and sort of see different approaches to the issue or the challenge that may be more universal than just in your local community. On a situation like this, it really resonates with me to hear you say, you know, it's a lot of work for any single district to take this on, particularly in such a sophisticated and fast-moving environment, with private partners who may have more resources at their disposal to sort of negotiate and arrange relationships. And so that's why, you know, a law like the one that we've worked on together, if we were to pass, or we've seen in other states, is so helpful. It adds leverage to every district. It creates sort of standardization across a state. Which is why we're also seeing, to your point, you know, the vendors are actually at the table sometimes too. It helps them not to have to negotiate individually with every district or differences across, you know, any given jurisdiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned In Bloom, which some people might not really remember or have known about. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the most prominent challenges, or perhaps even, for example, a scary situation, you know, that you've witnessed in terms of students and their data privacy.
Sure. So, you know, the biggest challenge is the fact that the burden of protecting students' privacy really, for the most part, falls on districts through FERPA.
Which is the the Federal Privacy Act for Education Records. And that was written, for those listening at home, I think in the 70s, hasn't been updated by Congress since. The U.S. Department of Education will regulate in that space. And I think the regulations most recently were a decade old. I worked on those when I was at a law firm.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So I think it was 76, so you're right, in the 70s. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, back then, all the records were on paper. And that's what the laws are written for, not the world we live in today. So applying that, you know, somewhat antiquated law to today's situation, the burden falls upon districts to protect all the data. This is an absence of a state law. And, you know, you think about school districts that, again, the majority don't have enough resources to address this. Teachers in the classroom, they all want to do great things. They all want to educate their students, and there's lots of great applications that come out. The model for many years has been freemium. You know, vendors purposely would target teachers with free software that eventually they would pay for, but instead of going to the administration, it's much easier to offer free services to the teachers. So there is this inherent model of great applications being thrown at educators that want to do great things, not really having any awareness around privacy, and they start using all these tools, not knowing where the student data is going, what protections are in place. And there certainly is a portion of those vendors that may not be doing the right thing with that data. I like to think that today the majority of ed tech vendors are aware of their obligations, are doing the right things, but in absence of any type of vetting or processes by the school districts or state laws that are protecting that data, it's almost like a Swiss cheese effect that the data is leaking out, and there are vendors that are reselling the data or doing other things, especially if it's a free app. It's, you know, somehow it's being funded, they're making money.
Right.
Yeah. So that kind of sets up the challenges. And just... What was the rest of your question? I'm sorry.
That was it. I think that was it. Sort of, you know, what are the scary situation or challenge, right?
Oh, yeah. So, and just to follow up on that, some real life examples or concrete evidence. Fordham University did a study not too long ago, 3 or 4 years, where they actually were able to locate children's and student data on the dark web. So it is a very real thing that there are some bad actors out there that are collecting data. There is value to that data of young children's data that, you know, has not yet been, it's kind of like virgin data that
Sure.
could be used for other things.
Sure.
So there definitely is a market out there. There are bad actors, and school districts and vendors have a responsibility to protect that and make sure it doesn't get into the wrong hands.
Absolutely. And I think that's become even more evident for people who may not have been thinking about this as closely as you have during a pandemic, when schools had to completely go online to reach their students. And certainly every teacher, was intentionally trying to find ways to engage the students. And so the software, I would have loved to have had some of these ed tech applications when I was in the classroom to just make the learning more engaging, more personalized, more multimedia. Yeah. However, as a teacher, I wouldn't have been thinking about the privacy implications unless someone was sort of responsible for making sure I was aware of that. So that's one thing that the bill would do, right? So the H127, the Student Educator Data Privacy Act, would establish in state law consistent expectations for what edtech vendors are able to do and not do with data that they're receiving through a relationship with a school district. It would also empower the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to have a person at the statewide level who's supporting all of this work by creating protocols and policies that districts can rely on when they're negotiating with an ed tech vendor, providing technical assistance, professional development. It also would charge every school district with identifying somebody sort of centrally who's keeping privacy as part of his or her portfolio, right? And providing information out to teachers. And doing some of this research, we've learned that Utah has a state law now that requires, as part of sort of professional development and licensure for educators, that privacy be part of their training. I'm thinking about filing a bill like that next session, Steve, so I might be coming to you. So those are some of the ways that I see the bill being responsive to the dynamics that you've described. Anything else you would add about the proposal itself in the bill in terms of sort of how it would address some of these issues?
Yeah, so those are all excellent points. In absence of a state bill, there is little motivation for school districts to put the time and effort into this, right? And it should not fall upon the teachers. The teachers don't have the time, to also vet applications. So Utah is definitely the prime example. They actually have an entire privacy office in their State Board of Education office that provides lots of training materials and resources, and a chief privacy officer basically for the Department of Ed. And so here in Massachusetts, without a state law to help kind of build the awareness, without the Department of Ed providing resources and training and building awareness around it, there is still a segment of schools in Massachusetts that I'm worried are not paying attention to it. The Massachusetts Student Privacy Alliance was the first one in the country, and now we're up to 31, but still less than half of the districts in Massachusetts belong to the alliance.
Right.
So there's definitely a gap there. And once this law, hopefully passes and does put some requirements on the districts, not too strenuous, but definitely building that awareness and DESE to do some training, I would feel much more comfortable that districts are going to move forward and take advantage of the tools that are out there, through the alliance and things
right,
like that.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of what what you and I have talked about in advocacy before the Education Committee or during a legislative briefing is the good news is a lot of this work already exists. It's just not consistently adopted across the Commonwealth. So we're not going to have to start from scratch. We'll build on what DESE has already started doing, what various education collaboratives or your alliance have been working on. So the work is already underway. It's just not reaching every student. And we talk a lot about sort of setting students up for success, social emotional health, mental health, academic preparedness. But if they don't, if in a dystopian, image, which maybe you lay awake at night sometimes thinking about since you live this day to day, students should have agency in their adulthood, and if their data has been collected from the time that they entered a preschool all the way through, for nefarious reasons, there may be some limitations on that agency. And so it's really critical as we continue to want to invite ed tech into the classrooms to support students and educators that we're being really mindful of how that data is used and how it's disposed of and deleted when it's no longer needed for the education purposes.
Yep. Absolutely. You said that very well.
Oh, well, thank you. Anything else you'd want policymakers to know or consider, when we're thinking about student learning, bringing forward the benefits of ed tech technology in ways that you found, your message really resonating perhaps elsewhere? What are some of the values that you bring, and I'm asking also as I continue to advocate for my bill, with perhaps colleagues who aren't really in this space right now?
So I think it's important that as this bill does, that the legislators, such as yourself and others that are writing it or offering edits, that you are engaging with the experts in the field.
Yes.
The practitioners. We have seen in other states bills propose that, as an aftermath, they then reach out to school districts and say, now implement this. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. Have you thought about how this is actually going to happen? There's sometimes unintended consequences. An example of that would be a state law that kind of generically prevents the creation of student profiles, with the data.
Right.
Which you should think would be a logical, something you'd want to prevent some vendors from doing. But when you think about the learning applications, lots of times they are building student profiles for personalized learning.
Absolutely right.
Right. So it's there's kind of details, right, that you need to think about in the protection, but still allowing for useful use of the data appropriately.
Exactly.
So being cautious of those unintended consequences, being cautious of, we already talked about, putting extra burdens on the school districts, making sure that the requirements are, realistic and guidance and the tools and resources are there, which I'm sure this bill does. But it's just things to think about for, like I said, if there's future edits or future bills, those are important.
Yes, including just for implementation, right? You can see a law get passed, but if it lacks the resources or sort of the on-ramp to making the requirements possible, it's not necessarily going to get implemented.
Yes.
Really well.
Yep.
So,
and in the end, the goal is really to be able to put these valuable tools into the hands of the teachers to help our students succeed and advance in a safe and secure way.
Right.
So we don't want to hinder what's going on in the classroom. We just want to make sure it's done in a safe and secure way.
Makes sense. Anything you'd want to add before we wrap in terms of just sort of what are your future hopes? I mean, I hope that this bill makes it into the law. I guess a silver lining on the fact that Massachusetts is one of 5 states that hasn't legislated here yet is that we were able to take a look at what other states have done and build and incorporate some of the best and innovative thinking there, and also maybe sidestep some of the unintended consequences that you've referenced. Let's say, so that's my hope in the next shorter than 5 to 10 years. But what about for you in terms of what might be true for students across the Commonwealth in respect to their data privacy?
Yep. So I'm confident your bill is going to pass.
Great. So
hopefully,
Yep.
I'm not, you don't call me back in a few months and I'm misspoke, but I'm quite confident. So I'm always kind of looking to the future, right, in this space and the consortium's work. What we're talking about in this bill is kind of the baseline that we're trying to get across the country.
Right.
There's 2 future projects that I feel are really going to impact the educational marketplace and really make it a secure ecosystem, right? Ideally, to take what I said before about teachers being able to onboard applications securely, it'd be great if there was a whole ed tech marketplace. Teachers could try out apps and know that they can try them out securely. And then if they want to onboard it, they could just click it and it could be integrated into their school's ecosystem and know that the data is protected.
That's
right?
great.
So some of the things to get there is having what we call privacy over the wire, the ability to convey privacy obligations in a standard specification. And that's something that, again, the consortium has created this spec. It's a global spec, and we're we're doing a proof of concept here in Massachusetts, actually, with
Excellent.
the Office of Executive Office of Education. And then secondly is security requirements. That is still kind of a gray area in education data. Privacy laws will often recommend industry best standards to protect the data, and there is no education data industry best standards. So one of the working groups of the consortium is to create a global education security standard that can be referenced across the globe.
That's great.
That all vendors can subscribe to, because this is as frustrating it is for districts, it's just as frustrating on the vendor side to have all these different laws and all these different requirements and different security requirements. So really just streamlining the whole process so we can eventually create this, we call it a connected and secure, effective learning ecosystem.
Excellent. And presumably that standard could evolve over time as technology evolves,
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
That's really lovely. Yeah. Well, I feel very grateful to have you as a constituent. I remember you emailed me shortly after I was sworn in, I was sworn in exactly 2 years ago today.
Oh, wow.
So if you're listening in a couple of weeks, we're talking right now on March 25th. And it was just delightful to hear from you and think, oh, well, that's actually something I'm really going to want to work on. So thank you for your engagement with your own state rep, but also for all the work and leadership that you've displayed for the Cambridge Public Schools and then all the districts around the Commonwealth in the absence of, a state law, as well as across the country and now some other countries as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kate. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to years to come.
That sounds great. Well, thanks everyone for listening today for my podcast with Steve Smith. We've been talking a lot about H127, the Student and Educator Data Privacy Act that I filed this legislative session, and the importance of considering student data privacy and security, even in the absence of that law. So please reach out to either of us if you have ideas or would like to be involved in this conversation. Be well.